and we're also not too far off a break, so hang in there with us. For those like myself, this is the really interesting nerdy stuff, and we're going to have a good time walking through this. Okay, so let's go from here. So in this section, we're going to walk through the components of a good organisational domestic and family violence policy. I'm going to highlight key elements, but I'm not going to cover everything in exhaustive detail, otherwise we'd be here for a very long time. And there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of this section. So if you've got a printed copy or are you using perhaps the review function in the Word document, pop in questions as you go or comments, and we'll have an opportunity to respond to them and discuss them at the end of this section. So you may notice that this is a policy and procedure model. So it starts with the policy and then shifts into the procedure. And that's fairly consistent with the Human Services Quality Framework policy templates. And you'll also notice that there's a disclaimer in the footer of the policy to seek independent legal advice and specialist domestic and family violence advice for your own organisational circumstances. So I work for a community legal centre. It would be very rare for us to produce a document that doesn't have some sort of disclaimer on it. And echoing what Stacey shared before, there is a requirement under the Work Health and Safety Act 2011 that employers consult with employees in relation to work health and safety issues, and that includes domestic and family violence at work. And also Stacey shared, not only is that a requirement, it's also a really great way to bring employees into the discussion, build ownership of that policy, and do prevention through awareness raising. So it's actually a really active, supportive approach to take by building that consultation process in, apart from any obligations we actually have. And you'll also notice at the top of that template, there's a highlighted bit in yellow, I think it is, I'd have to check, yep, which you can delete. And that's just really highlighting that this is a shifting space. That more research is emerging over time, and so to watch this space, and whenever you're reviewing your policy, to check out what the latest guidance is around good practice, because it's going to change and develop over time. So let's get into the policy stuff. We start with the policy statement. So this is where we recognise that domestic and family violence is a workplace issue. That might seem like a straightforward idea, but in some places that's still a fairly radical notion. So stating that really clearly is really important. This is where we state our commitment to providing support and flexibility to our staff. And this is also an opportunity, as I've said, to build prevention through awareness raising. So just the act of preparing this policy is important in and of itself. Then we shift to scope. So scope, many community organisations, community services organisations will have volunteers, they'll have casuals, they'll have students on placement, and this policy applies to them as well. So Section 7 of Queensland's Work Health and Safety Act includes volunteers and students and many other positions in their definition of worker. So we know that domestic and family violence is a whole of community issue, and what that scope speaks to is how this is a whole of workforce issue. So we're just dropping in little bits of legislation along the way for some bedtime reading after we've finished this presentation today. Then we shift to policies, and this is where you would reference any relevant existing policies, and we've provided an example list there. It might highlight what you've already got or potentially some gaps as well. Then we shift on to industrial instruments and legislation. So this is where you would include the legislation that's relevant to your workplace. So as an example, some community services organisations might be considered public entities under the Human Rights Act 2019 and some might not. So it's really important to have a think about, well, where do we fit in the landscape of legislation? And as I've mentioned before, we have a definition section, and this is really important because it helps build a shared understanding in our workforce of what domestic and family violence is. I have added a note in there about how domestic and family violence can include child abuse and or elder abuse, and you may want to consider mentioning this specifically in your definition because the voices of children and elders are often not heard in discussions about domestic and family violence, and this is an opportunity to lift up those voices. So we'll jump to the next slide, Stacey. Thank you. So we've included 8 components in this policy. Now, when you finish your own policy, it may have more, it may have less. This is a template for you to get as creative as you want with, obviously, within certain parameters. So the first one that we've included is, in an emergency, employees are encouraged to call 000. The reason we've put that in there is because staff need to feel able to make that call. I've done work in crisis settings and I feel really comfortable picking up the phone and hitting 000. That's not something that I worry about. Whereas other people who haven't done it very often, or who maybe have never done it, may be worried about whether or not it's the right thing to do. So we've lifted this out to really highlight it's okay to make that call. The other thing we've done is we've said that staff are encouraged to call, not that they will call. And that's because each person is going to respond differently in a situation like this. It's a subjective decision. You know, someone may have their own trauma response and may feel quite paralysed and unable to act. We don't want to penalise them around their reaction based on past trauma history. So that's why we're saying encouraged to call rather than you will call. So then we move to confidentiality and disclosure, and this is really, really important. So this is a section where you can provide practical guidance for colleagues and for managers around how to respond to disclosures of domestic and family violence. And there's an example clause in there that does just that. We've also noticed specifically that staff don't have to disclose their experiences, and that's so that employees don't feel like, oh, they've mentioned something, I have to dig, I have to keep digging until I get it out of them. And so that people know that they don't have to disclose, and that really respects the dignity and self-determination of people who are experiencing violence. This is also where we note there are limits to confidentiality. So obviously if you're calling 000, you know, if there's an emergency, you can't keep that to yourself. And if the workplace, if there's a safety risk to the workplace, that will need to be escalated. So they're 100% confidentiality may never be able to be guaranteed. And by including that in there, it means you allow people to make informed choices about what they share, and also provide guidance to staff around, you know, if someone says, don't ever tell anyone, that there is actually documentation in place to say, well, actually, I do have to share this. And that's not about me dobbing you or anything. It's actually our organisational policy. We've included a clause about adverse action. So this is, we thought this might be helpful in terms of helping people to feel safer to disclose if they know that their job isn't at risk because they're experiencing domestic and family violence. And as I've shared before, that's been the experience of working women's centres in Australia, of speaking to women who have had their employment terminated or been subjected to performance management because of their experiences of domestic and family violence, and an employer not knowing or understanding how to respond to that. We've also referenced records management here because that's part of confidentiality. We need to think about how information will be stored and will be used and who will have access to it. And this is really important for the safety and well-being of the person using violence, for the person experiencing violence. So I'll talk more about that as we go through, but one of the things to hold in mind is who has access to this information. Whenever you're recording something about this, who has access to this? And if someone, for example, has a relative who works in HR or has a partner who's monitoring their pay slips, you know, there may be someone who has access to information, and it may not be safe for the victim survivor to take any information with them, either physically or electronically, because the person using violence may notice that, and that may not go so well. So the next step we've included there is a prevention, awareness raising and capability development statement. So this is all about what your organisation is going to do in response to the issue of domestic and family violence. So that could include commitments to training, to doing a gender equity audit, and a shout out to Women's Health Queensland who do gender equity audits. And if you Google them, you'll get contact details for them. It's an opportunity to do a whole of safety workplace safety review. It might be commitment to providing informational material in the workplace. So something as simple as having 1-800 RESPECT posters on the backs of bathroom doors. And in this section, you would also include the identify the communication strategy that's going to be used for this, because it's no good having great information without a way of communicating that. So we get to the next bit, which is support options. And as the title of the policy, of the workshop, sorry, says, it's not just leave. So this is quite a chunky section. So we will start with leave. So this is where you would record leave entitlements and how to request that leave. And the example leave clause that we've included states, leave may be taken by an employee as consecutive or single days or as a fraction of a day. And that reflects people may need leave in different ways. They may have a regular trauma counselling appointment they need to see, so they'll need to take a couple of hours on a day each fortnight. Or they may have just separated from a partner who's violent and they're moving house and they're getting kids settled into new schools and they'll need longer time off, a bigger chunk of leave. So that helps people understand that it doesn't just have to be done one way. Then we have flexible working arrangements. So there's a right to request flexible working arrangements under the Fair Work Act. So this is where we talk about how to request that. And you don't have to reinvent the wheel here. The Fair Work Ombudsman website, and I'll include this link in one of the later slides, does provide templates for a template letter to request a flexible work arrangement and a template response for an employer. So some of this stuff is already written for you, which is quite helpful. Then we shift to evidentiary requirements. So there's no evidence to suggest that these entitlements to leave or flexible work arrangements are being abused, which is good. And sometimes documentation can actually be really difficult to supply. So if the victim survivor has never sought help before, or if they don't have access to any of their records. So in the template we've given, we suggested the manager may request reasonable evidence. So this can help strike a balance between facilitating quick access to support and also seeking evidence, for example, where a person using violence may be stating that they are the victim survivor. Then we have a section around counselling support. So do you know who your local domestic and family violence service is? And building on what was shared before by Hayley, if the local service may not be appropriate because of pre-existing relationships, who's the alternative? And maybe you would establish an alternative, or it would be one of the national helplines like 1-800-RESPECT or the Domestic Violence Impact Loan run by Rape and Domestic Violence Services Australia. You may have an EAP service. Not all EAP services are domestic and family violence informed. So they may be helpful, they may be not. So it's worthwhile checking that out with your EAP provider. You can include the numbers for state and national helplines. All those numbers can be stored right there, ready to go. Just bearing in mind, as we know, funding cycles rotate, and the organisations that hold the funding to deliver domestic and family violence services may change over time. So make sure those details are updated as needed. Then we shift to support for work performance and attendance. So that's where we make allowance for reasonable adjustments to be made for a discrete period of time. So that might be changes in start and finish times, and that might help respond to the risk of stalking. So if they have predictable working start and finish times, that becomes predictable for the person stalking them. And then we might have other workplace support and role adjustments, which are basically longer term. So this is where you might have a job redesign, might have redeployment, could be something like providing an ergonomic chair and setup for a person who may be impacted by physical injuries arising from domestic and family violence. And asking the person what they need is one of the best ways to find out the best way forward here. Then in this section, we identify contact persons, so usually by position rather than name. So they might include health and safety representatives, a manager, a human resources representative, a union delegate, and that will really vary depending on the size and the resources of your workforce. And something that's important to consider is that colleagues may be needing support as well as the person who's directly impacted by the domestic and family violence. So you may want to make statements about specific types of support being available to other staff in the workplace. So for example, a worker who receives a disclosure of domestic and family violence, or a worker who witnesses an incident of domestic and family violence in the car park, that may impact on their mental health and well-being, and they may need to access support as well. So this is an opportunity to build in support for everyone in the workplace. So then we shift on to the next two sections in this policy, and hopefully you're tracking along there with the template there. So this is an emerging policy space, this one, employees who use or may use domestic and family violence. So this is a really preventative approach by including this in a policy, because it really sets what our standards and expectations are. It lets people know that using violence is not okay, and it may help keep victim survivors safer. Now, some organisations may prefer to make this a separate policy, so where they would have one policy focused on supporting a person experiencing domestic and family violence and also their colleagues, and then another policy that's focused on responding to an employee who's using or may be using domestic and family violence. So some things to consider in this section or in a separate policy. The safety of the victim survivor is paramount in any action taken by the workplace in response to an employee who's using violence, and you can state that quite clearly in the policy. And that's because there can be flow-on effects, because you can imagine if someone who's using violence is suddenly terminated, there may be flow-on effects in terms of how they choose to take that out on someone else. We want to include a clear statement that the organisation will not tolerate the use of work resources to perpetrate any violence, and that use of work resources may be subject to disciplinary action or performance management. So that provides clear expectations of staff behaviour and clear information about possible consequences. Then another slightly tricky area is that an employee who uses or may use domestic and family violence may also state that they're a victim survivor. If that's the case, they do have access to supports available to victim survivors. However, this is also, as I've mentioned before, where a request for reasonable evidence to substantiate requests for support may be relied upon. Another thing to bear in mind also is the idea of systems abuse. So that's where the person using violence, again, may claim that they are the victim survivor and that the victim survivor is the person using violence against them. That's a bit of a circular sentence there. It's hard to keep track of. And what can result there is there may be orders taken out against both parties. So a person who has an order against them may actually be the victim survivor, and the person who's using violence is using systems to abuse them. So we do want to make sure we have leave and support available to people who are experiencing domestic and family violence. We also suggest committing, sorry, I'll just step back a bit. I will mention that leave and the rights to request flexible work arrangements aren't legislated entitlements for employees who use domestic and family violence. So there's no legislated obligation to provide this. It's only for victim survivors. What we found though is that some organisations have made the decision to make support available to employees who are taking action to address their behaviour and stop using violence. So for example, an organisation may make leave available or flexible working arrangements available to someone who's attending a behavioural change program or counselling. So that's something for your organisation to consider. It may be that someone requests leave to attend court processes, but we do bear in mind that, again, the concept of systems abuse, where a person using violence may be using court processes to draw out the abuse against the victim survivor. And if they're getting access to leave from work to attend that court and enact that systems abuse, that could be quite problematic. So what we would really encourage, and make a commitment to this in the policy, is commit to seeking legal advice and advice from a domestic and family violence service before taking disciplinary action against an employee who's using violence, especially if there's a termination of employment is on the cards. You don't have to do this alone. So I hope I haven't scared you or anything with this section. You really don't have to do this alone. There are services available at a national level, 1-800-RESPECT and the Domestic Violence Impact Line. There are also legal services you can contact. So Legal Aid Queensland, Women's Legal Service Queensland, the Caxton Legal Centre. It may be that you have a law firm that you contact in relation to other matters. There are places that you can contact to get advice. Now, the next section is all about preparing the workplace to respond if there is an incident of domestic and family violence. So this is about being responsive instead of reactive. Responsive means you've got information, you're prepared. Reactive means, something's happened, what do we do? So this is to help you to be responsive. This identifies workplace safety planning processes and how this dovetails with personal safety planning with a domestic and family violence service. So another role that this particular section, safety in the workplace, plays is that it sort of reinforces that idea that this is a workplace safety issue and that people aren't responsible for safety planning around the entirety of someone's life. This is about workplace safety, and this plan may dovetail and complement a personal safety plan that someone is developing with a domestic violence service. And as I've mentioned before, it may not be safe for the victim survivor to take any information with them physically or electronically. So as an example of electronically, if the person using violence against them has coerced login information from them, they may have access to their work details. And an email about this sort of stuff to the work account might be visible by the person using violence. So be really, really mindful of that. So then we're shifting on to the last couple of points before questions. So this one here, section 7 about responsibilities, we've taken from the Queensland Government's model policy template, and that's a really good complementary document to have with you, as well as their guide around responding to employees who use or may use violence, and those are resources that we'll provide to you at follow-up. So this section outlines the responsibilities of employees according to their role. So depending on how you've written the policy, you may think this is not actually going to be useful because you've covered it all already, or you may find it is very useful to just go boom, 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 this is who's responsible for what. So it's really up to you how you use this section. And then finally, we have supporting documents. So that's where you make note of the forms that assist implementation of the policy and procedure. So that could include a critical incident reporting form, the DFV work-aware safety planning tools, forms to apply for leave and request flexible work arrangements, and so on. And as I flagged, Fair Work Ombudsman has done some of the hard work here for us and popped in templates to request flexible working arrangements and to respond to those, as well as a whole bunch of other templates as well.